talk about all of the AP exam changes and updates for the year. So I know we've talked a little bit piece by piece about the different types of FRQs and the multiple choice, but now we're going to kind of put it all together and, have one lesson where we just really just focus on the changes this year for the AP exam, because there are a lot. And then at 8:30, I'm going to talk about chemical oceanography, which is kind of the next part of the, for the next module for oceanography. So after this geological oceanography module, which we're doing right now, which is like plate tectonics and stuff, we're going to go into chemical oceanography, and that's what we'll talk about tonight. So you'll have kind of a good kind of introduction to the module before you go ahead and get started with it later this week. So let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about the AP exam changes. So there are a lot of changes this year. They've changed the weight of the exam a little bit. So the living world, ecosystems, and biodiversity are each about 6%, 6 to 8% each, which means they're about 12 to 16% total, that living world section. Populations are about 10 to 15%, or systems and resources, 10 to 15%, land and water use, 10 to 15%, energy resources and consumption, about 10 to 15%. Atmospheric pollution is 7 to 10, and then aquatic and terrestrial pollution is 7 to 10. So together, that's 14 to 20%. So that's reduced a little bit. It used to be a lot more, pollution was a lot more. And then global change is 15 to 20%, which is kind of increased. So that's kind of how we can kind of break down the change to the AP exam a little bit as far as content goes. So now let's talk about the multiple choice tests. So what do we have here? So they've got what they call science practice concepts now. And then they're telling you about how much of the multiple choice section is that part and how much of the free response section is that part. So for practice 1, that's just like explaining concepts. That's 30 to 38% on the multiple choice and 13 to 20% of the free response. So, a pretty big part of your test, like 43 to 58%. That's a large percentage. Visual representation. So that's like looking at images and things like that, and being able to like interpret images or things like that. So it's 12 to 19% on the multiple choice exam and 6 to 10 on the free response. Analyzing text. So that's those problems that we kind of talked about before, where it's like a little bit of text that you have to read, and then you have to like, respond based on that bit of text. And remember, it's not text analysis like you think of in a in like a history class or something like that. It's a little less than that. There's not as many documents and things like that to read. And then that's not explicitly assessed at all in the free response section. 4 is scientific experiments. That's 2 to 4% of the multiple choice, not a ton, but then 10 to 14% in the free response, which is a decent amount. So this is, remember, there's a whole free response on scientific experiments, right? So this is understanding what a hypothesis should look like, or what a scientific experiment should look like, what your control group looks like, your independent, your dependent variable, that kind of stuff. Just, the basics of science. Practice 5 is data analysis. And so that's going to ask you maybe to look at a graph and kind of analyze the graph, or a table or something like that. And that's 12 to 19% on the multiple choice section and 6 to 10 on the free response. Mathematical routines, that's, you're going to do some calculations there. That's 6 to 9% of the multiple choice and 20% of the free response. Now remember, you do get calculators now. So let me just write this on here just in case, because as you guys are studying for the AP exam, if you look at old AP information, you might see that it says no calculators, and that's because this is the first year that calculators are allowed. They've said that means that the math isn't going to be any more difficult, but that they're going to use more like real world numbers. So they're not going to use numbers that, before when you had to do it all in your head or, by hand, they had to use numbers that like divided out nicely and things like that. And they're not necessarily going to use this anymore. They're going to use more real life numbers. So that's basically why they said they wanted to add calculators. And that should be right here for math. Okay, although you may need it for your data analysis as well. And then environmental solutions. Let's figure out what we need to do to solve these problems, thinking critically. 17 to 23% on the multiple choice and 26 to 34 on the free response. There's a huge part of the free response that wants you to really think critically, and they might give you some sort of environmental problem and you've got to come up with a solution, a practical solution to that problem. And so that's a huge part of your free response, actually a huge part of your test. They want you guys to apply what you've learned and not just regurgitate facts and things like that. So let's go to the next thing. A number 2 pencil for the multiple choice section, and then you get a blue or black. It says blue or black pencil. It should say pen. Let me make this ink a little thicker. There we go. And it should be pen. Okay. So, and this hasn't changed. For your multiple choice, you'll want a number 2 pencil. So, pick one with a good eraser, so you can erase. They used to make these, I don't even remember what type. Let me see. I may have one in my desk. I do. This is the brand, and they have really nice, those like soft white erasers that are so nice. I used to actually give them to my students the day before the AP exam so they could bring them, but I can't do that for y'all. So here's the brand, and the pencil is black and it has a white eraser. And those are my absolute favorite. I know it's silly. They're even better than the Ticonderogas that everyone likes, but they're kind of pricey, so that's why I only use them for the AP exam. But the eraser just erases really nice, which is, nice when you've got that Scantron sheet and you don't want to like ruin it when you're erasing it, erase a hole in it or whatever. So anyway, that's the pencil that I would suggest for your AP exam. And then you need a blue or black pen for the free response section. I would use a ballpoint pen rather than one of those like gel or ink pens, because you don't want it like smearing everywhere and things like that. So that's what I would use for the free response. So, and then you get a graphing or / scientific calculator on your exam. And this PDF of this presentation is posted in the course under Jigsaw Resources. And this actually, this part right here is a link, and it will take you straight to the section for the AP exam that shows you exactly what type of calculator you are allowed and what type of calculator you are not. And you can use it on both sections. So that's pretty nice that you get to have that calculator. And I would just use, the same calculator all semester. If you don't have one yet, I'd go ahead and get one. And that way, you're using the same calculator all semester. You're really familiar with how it works. So when you get into that exam, you're not using like a weird calculator, and you don't know how to make exponents on it or whatever, you know exactly how to use it. So that's what I would do. I would make sure that you're using a calculator that you're familiar with. So now let's talk about the AP exam. This is the old exam. So it says current, but it's basically last year's exam, or before this year. You had 100 multiple choice questions and you got an hour and 30 minutes to do them, and it was 60% of your exam score. Okay. There was no text-based stimulus, so nothing where you had to like read text, and then you had 5 choices on every question. Now you get 80 questions, so you get 20 less questions in the same amount of time, but that's because they want you to analyze text now. So they're kind of like accounting for the fact that you'll have to do a little more reading, and the fact that you're going to have to do a little more looking at data and analyzing data. So that stuff they think takes a little more time. So they're giving you 20 less questions, but they're giving you these questions that are a little more time consuming. So that's kind of the trade-off here. And then you only have 4 choices instead of 5, which is excellent because when you had 5 choices and you had your safety letter, that random whatever letter you had, B, C, whatever you want to pick, you had a 20% chance of getting it right if you used your safety letter. Well, now you have a 25% chance of getting it right if you use your safety letter. So that's kind of handy. And if you can narrow down even just one question, you're going to have a 33% chance of getting it right instead of a 25. So it's really nice that you only have 4 options instead of 5 now. That makes it a little bit easier. So that's pretty handy. And so let's talk about the multiple choice. They have some details as to a little more detail about what it's going to look like. You're going to get 3 to 4 sets of quantitative data. Remember, quantitative means numbers, right? So that's numerical data. Such as data tables, charts, graphs, and remember those practices we talked about earlier? It's primarily 5, but it can also be 1, 4, 6, or 7. So, when we did a question where you had to say, like, in the beginning of the graph, the end of the graph, what was the change, that kind of thing. All of that is considered that part. And there's 3 to 4 sets of those. So that might mean that you have, one graph and then it has maybe 3 questions with that graph. So it's not necessarily saying that you're only going to have like 3 to 4 questions. Okay. The next set is, it says it's 3 to 4 sets of qualitative data or information, such as models, representations, or maps. And the way I remember qualitative is basically words, right? There's no numbers in qualitative data, so you won't have to do any calculations. You won't really have to do anything with numbers. They're just going to want you to kind of maybe describe the differences between the two different. For example, if you had like population pyramids, they might want you to explain the difference between those two, or a map, what's going on in that map, that kind of stuff. And then you'll have 2 sets of questions with text-based source. Okay, so these are talking about the set questions. You'll also have a set of questions that don't have a set. There's just an individual standalone question. Who wrote Silent Spring, for example, or what is biogeography? Okay, they may have, those are single questions. They're not a set. They're just standalone questions. These are the set questions, which means there's more than one question that goes with each set. Okay, so the text-based sources are going to have, some sort of passage that you have to read. And again, it's not going to be as long as a passage as you might see on a history test or an English test. It's going to be much shorter, but you're going to have to answer questions about that passage. And they'll usually want you to apply your knowledge about that passage. So it won't be like in paragraph 5, what did they say was the pollutant? It'll be, describe a solution, which would be the best solution for that pollution or something like that. Okay. So they're really getting away from regurgitation questions. They really want you to kind of think, critical thinking, use your knowledge. Use your knowledge of environmental science to apply it to the situations on your test. So now let's talk about the free response section, and this has also changed. So in the past, so this is the old exam. Okay. In the past, you got 4 questions and you got an hour and 30 minutes to answer those questions. It was 40% of your exam score. And then the question types vary in the skills they assess, but you usually had one data set question. This would be your math question. You had one document-based question. These are the ones that had like, that we've done with like the Fremont articles. That's what they meant here. And then two synthesis and evaluation questions, which are, I thought, the most straightforward. They give you some information and you have to answer questions about it. Okay, so now this is the new exam here. Oop. Okay. Okay, so instead of 4 questions, you're only going to have 3 FRQs, but they're going to reduce the amount of time you have to take to answer the questions accordingly. So your AP exam is actually going to be 20 minutes shorter, right? Because it used to be an hour and 30 and an hour and 30, and now it's an hour 30 and an hour 10. So the whole exam is 20 minutes shorter. And now they're going to have the same type of questions every single year. So you will have one question that asks you to design and analyze an investigation. This is like experimental design. Okay, this is why I think it is so important that you guys understand hypothesis and independent and dependent variables, and you have an analysis section. This is why we write so many lab reports, because that's basically what you're doing in your lab report is you are designing and analyzing investigations. Okay, that's basically what your lab report is. And so this is, preparing you for this type of FRQ. Questions two is going to ask you to analyze an environmental problem and propose a solution using models and representations. Okay, so this might mean they may give you a graph, they may give you tables, something like that. And they'll want you to use that to help analyze and propose a solution to that. And the third question type is going to ask you to do math. Okay, so this is where you're going to do math. And the big thing with these math questions is the entire 10 points of the FRQ, right? FRQs are always 10 points. The entire 10 points are not math points. So even if you don't know how to do the math that they've asked you, still read the question and look at it, because you can leave the math parts blank and answer the question parts. And usually about half of it's math and half of it's words. And so you could still answer the word half and still get like half of the points for that FRQ. So you should never leave it blank, because, points are points. And then additionally, like your math, there were like 3 parts of the math, part A, B, and C. And you had no idea how to do part A, but part B and part C you did know how to do. Make up an answer for part A, make it an easy number like 100, and then use that answer to answer part B and part C. That way you can still get some of your math points. So that's, and that's from previous years too. If you get part A wrong, but you get B and C correct using your wrong answer, like you solve the problem correctly using that wrong answer, you're supposed to get full credit for B and C. So you'd only lose credit for like part A. So that's why I say make up a fake answer. And since you're making up, an answer anyway, make it easy. Make the number easy. Don't make like 726, make it 100, because it's much easier to work with. So now let's talk a little bit about the free response. The first free response is the design and investigation, right? This is going to give you an environmental scenario, and then they'll give you some sort of model or visual or some data, and they want you to describe and explain the concepts in that scenario. They want you to analyze that data. They would maybe want you to look at a research study that would maybe test those principles, and then describe environmental problems or solutions. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is analyze an environmental problem and propose a solution. So that one is going to give you, again, another environmental scenario with a model or a visual representation or some data, right? They both seem to have that. And they're going to ask you to describe or explain the concepts, the processes, something going in there, right? That's That's very similar to this, right? They want you to analyze visual representations or data. Again, same thing as in question 1. And they want you to propose or justify a solution to the environmental problem. So that's really where this one is different, right? They want you to come up with a solution. Use your knowledge of environmental science and come up with a solution. Okay. And then the third type is analyzing an environmental solution and proposing a solution, but you're also going to do calculations. Okay. So you're going to describe environmental concepts, processes, and models in written format again, right? That's in all 3 of these. You're going to apply quantitative methods, right? Here's your math. This is where they want you to use math. But again, you get that calculator, and then they want you to propose and justify solutions to the environmental problems. So that's the same as this one. They're just going to ask you, you're not going to use math on the second one, which you will use it on the third one. So that's kind of how that works. And then these are the task verbs that they're going to be using in your free response. They're going to use calculate. That means they want you to do math. You have to show your work. Okay, this is crucial. Okay, a lot of times the rubrics for these questions say if the student gets the correct answer but doesn't show their work, they don't get any points. Okay, so you always need to show your work. This is super, super, super important. You don't want to, do everything you need to do for this question and then lose the points because you didn't show your work, right? Describe means you need to provide relevant characteristics of that topic. Okay, describing, a lot of times students struggle with describe and explain because describing means you need to say why. You need to say how. Okay, why? How is this happening? You don't want to say it causes eutrophication. You want to explain why eutrophication occurs. Or you don't want to say it kills the fish. You want to say why that kills the fish. Okay, so you need to describe and explain. And you need to do it at a level to where they're not going to go, oh yeah, my mom could answer that question that way. You want to describe it at an AP level, at a college level. So that reader that's reading your exam goes, oh yeah, this person definitely knows what they're talking about. They definitely need college credit for this course. Okay, you don't want them to go, could a 5th grader answer that question that way? Yeah, they probably could. Okay. So you want to write it at a college level. You're proving to them that you deserve this college credit. Okay. Identify means that's all you have to do. You just have to identify. It's the easiest one. You don't have to provide any rationale. You don't have to describe. If they say identify and describe, usually you're going to get a point for identifying and a point for describing. If they say identify and describe, usually you need both. But if they say identify and describe and you only identify, you're not going to get that describe point. Okay. Justify. That means you want to use evidence to support. So that means you may want to, draw on the data table, discuss the data table, any data they've provided you. You may want to, refer back to the prompt, any information they gave you in the prompt. Or you may want to use, your knowledge of environmental science that's in your head, right? But somehow you have to justify your answer. You can't just provide your answer and be done. You have to say why that's going to work. Again, that why, how kind of thing. Okay. Make a claim. You want to make an assertion that is based on evidence or knowledge. Okay. You can't just make something willy-nilly, totally off the cuff. It has to relate somehow to evidence or knowledge, something, based in fact. And then propose a solution. You want to propose a solution, again, based on evidence or knowledge. So if they say, you know, whatever, I can't even think of a good example off the top of my head, but you can't say something totally realistic. Oh, well, we'll just all move to the moon. That's not a based on evidence or knowledge, right? We can't all move to the moon. That doesn't make any that's not realistic. That's not practical. Okay? So it needs to be realistic and practical. Okay. And then our last thing that we have here is they've really done something really neat this year. Usually we have this list of legislation, and we'll have a project at the very end of the semester that goes over a ton of legislation. And it's useful because it does help you. But basically, kind of any environmental legislation was free game. They could ask you about it and you would have to know. So they've really tampered that down and narrowed it down. And they've said, okay, these are the pieces of legislation that you really need to know for the APES exam. And so it's not any piece of environmental legislation that's ever happened. It's these. These are the few. Okay. So it's really nice that they've done this for you because, like I said, in the past, that was not the case. And you had to just, you had to assume that they could ask you about any piece of environmental legislation out there, which there's a lot. Okay, so it's really nice that they did this for you. Look, exactly 10. Okay, and it's nice because sometimes they'll say on an FRQ, they'll say, provide a piece of legislation that would prove this point or that would, save this animal or whatever. And so I used to try and tell students that have a couple pieces of legislation that you know really, really well. And these are just your you kind of have them in your back pocket because they're really widely applicable and you could apply it to almost any situation. And so these are the three that I like the best: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, because you can almost use those in almost any situation. You can find a way that it applies and you could make a case for it. So I like these three. The next set that is really good, CERCLA is obviously a big one. CITES is huge. And also another thing about this is if you are on the AP exam, you don't have to remember Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. You can just say CITES, and they're supposed to give you points for that. So you don't have to remember like the long name for it. You can just remember the small name or the short name. So the short name for the Clean Air Act is CAA. We use that a lot. The Clean Water Act is CWA. The Endangered Species Act is ESA. Okay, so basically, these are the kind of like big changes for the AP exam this year. Hopefully this was helpful. It gives you a little bit of a better idea of what to expect this year on the AP exam. Remember, this is the first year we've done this exam, and so I haven't seen a released exam. I haven't seen released FRQs or anything like that. This is just what they've told us, how it changes from the past exams. So we'll really get a good idea, unfortunately, after this year. But this is how they've said it's going to change. And they really have kind of laid it out for you very, very step by step, and provided a lot of details about the changes, which we did not have anything like that in the past. So this is very nice of them, and it's nice for you to have.